So Syrian opposition forces continue to advance in multiple directions, and it does not look like any of Assad's buddies are quickly rushing to help him out. Well, maybe some Iranian militias, but we also got footage earlier today of some American A-10s providing close air support in eastern Syria, which, could be a problem for some of those groups. So we're going to dive into that, take a look at a Syrian opposition drone school, some of the tactics they've picked up, probably from the ongoing war in Ukraine, and then some information on how HTS, the group leading the opposition charge at this point, has gone about kind of stability operations in areas like Aleppo that they have since taken from the Assad regime. And warning on that one, you might have some mixed emotions. It's tricky, as expected. Now, starting out, there's a couple of articles I wanted to highlight here written by some legitimate Syria experts. They'll both be linked in the description below. The first one is titled The Backstory Behind the Fall of Aleppo by Hassan and Michael Weiss. They said, quote, there were two concurrent battles that started last Wednesday. The first, named Repelling Aggression, was led by HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or Organization for the Liberation of the Levant, and the second was The Dawn of Freedom, launched by the SNA, a collection of Islamist insurgents and former Free Syrian Army factions backed by Turkey. More on that, little difference later, but just as a reminder, if you're just hearing about some of these groups and some of these places for the first time, I made a video a few days ago diving more in depth to these different organizations, their mixed alliances, and what they're fighting for in Syria. I'll link that in the description as well. Weiss and Hassan mentioned that HTS practically controls all of Idlib province now and large parts of Aleppo, Syria's largest province. They said overall the regime suffered a complete breakdown in command and control and morale, leaving it unable to regroup or mount a counteroffensive. HTS overshot its own mark in a blitzkrieg that Western analysts see as a, quote, catastrophic success. And a couple notes there. What they're talking about in that regard is something that can happen in military operations. As an example, let's say that an operation plans to reach phase line 2, right? You move past phase line 1, you're going to culminate on or about phase line 2. If they're so successful, they reach, say, phase line 8 or 9, it's entirely possible that the troops on the ground don't have the logistical support and the capabilities to push that or to maintain the depth of that penetration, right? They might not have the resources to hold the ground that they've since taken. Entirely possible that that's what's happening right now with HTS. I do want to mention that on some Russian channels, I'm seeing comments about a possible Syrian counteroffensive in portions of Aleppo. Not a lot of confirmation from that other than kind of the same channels repeating the same claims over and over again. So something to keep an eye on. Now also, as of this recording, it does sound like opposition forces have begun their assault on Hama, a city a little further south in Syria. So, we'll see how that goes, but entirely likely that the next update video is going to be talking about that battle and possibly opposition forces taking it from Assad. Now, this article here by Hassan and Weiss dove into 3 specific reasons that they cite for why the pro-Assad forces in Aleppo fell so quickly. They said one was the penetration of a high-level security meeting in Aleppo, during which an Iranian brigadier general and several Syrian officers were killed. The result was chaos in the city's security operations and fear among officials in the city. Another was the use of sleeper cells inside of Aleppo, which coordinated with the rebels, ensuring the further disruption of efforts to mobilize a garrison from an intact fallback position. Yet another was that the rebels chose their targets wisely, bypassing more fortified positions such as the military academy and artillery college, strongholds located approximately 4 miles southwest of the city, where they might have been mired in static fighting. So there's still a lot to be learned about how this happened so quickly. I think it's pretty safe to say at this point that HTS and other allied opposition groups fighting kind of under their banner or alongside them at this point had been planning this offensive for some time. This wasn't a last minute kind of take advantage of an opportunity. They clearly had planned and rehearsed what they were going to do here, as is evidenced by some of the actions taken by HTS as soon as they liberated some of this territory from the Assad regime. Now, a video I wanted to highlight that just came out yesterday that I'll play here shows some of the drone tactics and techniques being utilized in this war. And this is really the first conflict, I would say, since the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where we're seeing some of the most advanced drone tactics put into use right away. When you look at what's happening in the war between Gaza or Hamas and Israel in Gaza, even with Hezbollah further north, we're not seeing the same degree of kind of FPV and quadcopter use of drones. It's much more military-grade equipment, if you will. However, what the opposition put together in this video that I thought was really interesting was a couple things showing just how they're able to manufacture these drones inside of Syria, as well as how they're training these drone pilots and then their actual use in the battlefield. So a couple things stand out here. This was something kind of a lesson learned from the war in Ukraine. Drones can get really expensive. So what we're seeing a lot of forces, especially in Ukraine, do is find ways to manufacture certain components and then buy other components in bulk. And you're kind of manufacturing your own homemade drone, if you will, for significantly cheaper than buying them, especially in the quantities needed to have a real impact on the battlefield. We never really saw that from Hamas. Hamas at times continued to use, kind of patched together drones, but they were more like the old UAVs that they would use to crash into things with explosives more than these kind of more advanced FPVs and quadcopters. We do see the training taking place here, which might look silly, but it's actually how we've seen drone pilots be trained in the war in Ukraine so far. And I did want to highlight this to show, there was a lot of talk as soon as this conflict kicked off that there must be Ukrainian advisors on the ground or the Ukrainian military had to have been training some of these opposition forces. Look, maybe, I don't know. I'm not there. I don't want to write that off entirely. I do know Ukraine's kind of got their hands full fighting back a Russian invasion of their own country at this point. However, there have been various stories of Ukrainian special operations forces involved in kind of countering the Russian presence in various portions of the Middle East and Africa. But a lot of what we're seeing in terms of the drone warfare could be picked up by just watching footage out of the war in Ukraine, right? None of what you've seen so far is classified or secret. And if you follow this channel, we're constantly showing kind of all aspects of these drone wars. An interesting piece that is kind of taking shape here is that a lot of the groups being targeted on the ground are aligned with Russia or Iran and have been trained by Russian forces in the past. And what it looks like is a lot of the tactics picked up by Russia and Ukraine, they didn't pass those along to their allies in Syria. We're seeing large troop concentrations walk around in areas with drones directly overhead. It doesn't look like the electronic warfare jamming is taking place, like hardly at all. And by and large, drop after drop, drone footage after drone footage, it really looks like the Syrian forces on the ground are not prepared in any way, shape, or form for drone warfare. And that's interesting, again, because their kind of primary ally, primary backer, one of them at least, is Russia, who is arguably at the forefront of fighting this exact type of war. All right, so zooming out a little bit, more big picture, talking about who might be coming to help, and the answer there is maybe nobody, actually. So Syrian President Assad put out a statement yesterday saying, quote, "The terrorist escalation that is taking place reflects far-reaching goals in an attempt to divide the region, fragment its countries, and redraw the maps anew according to the interests and goals of America and the West. This escalation will only increase Syria's determination to confront and eliminate terrorism in all Syrian territories." And this is something, by and large, we've seen across a lot of channels at this point. There's very few pro-Syrian sources that are attributing the HTS success and goals to anything other than the United States, Israel, the broader West, and at times even Ukraine. Now, going back to the Hassan and Weiss article, they said, quote, "Russian jets only started pounding targets in the city, many of them characteristically civilian, including a Franciscan Italian church within the last 48 hours. Idlib has been under constant Russian bombardment for years, and that hasn't changed. Otherwise, the cavalry isn't coming, it's retrenching." And that seems to be the case. We've talked about it before. Russia doesn't have a lot of capabilities they could quickly send to Syria, even if they wanted to at this point. They're certainly prioritizing the war in Ukraine. However, there is a Russian naval presence based out of the Tartus base in the Mediterranean, and this is arguably one of the main reasons, really kind of one of the main reasons, that the Russian military has a presence in Syria at all, is to maintain that sole access to the Mediterranean. And just yesterday, we started to see some rumors that the Russian Navy might be leaving. I think that might have been a little premature because at the same time, or shortly thereafter, we got a press release from the Russian Ministry of Defense saying on November 3rd, 2024, during an exercise to practice methods of joint actions by groups of forces of the Russian Navy and Aerospace Forces in the eastern part of the Mediterranean Sea, high-precision sea and air-based missiles were launched. Essentially, they conducted kind of a large-scale naval and air military exercise in the Mediterranean. The Russian statement made it sound like this had long been planned. It was on the schedule. They're just kind of keeping with what was already set to take place. They didn't tie it really at all in any way, shape, or form to what's happening in Syria. So one of the ways, obviously, to interpret this is Russia kind of signaling that they could use these assets to support Assad, pushing back some of the HTS-led opposition groups. But it's interesting why they would just signal that when they are taking an active role in striking opposition forces, why they then move their naval vessels off the coast and conduct practice exercises instead of like actually striking opposition force locations. But either way, it is notable that amidst all of this, and there's rumors that, at some point the Russian Navy might have to make that hard decision. Do they stay and risk being surrounded and possibly overrun by these opposition forces, or do they evacuate and give up the Tartus naval base? Now, Hezbollah is another group. We've kind of been waiting to see what they're going to do, if they're going to do anything. And there's been an argument for a while now that one of the reasons that HTS kicked off this offensive was because Hezbollah was a little bit tied up with Israel. And just yesterday, a Hezbollah spokesperson put out a statement saying, quote, "The Syrian army does not need fighters. It can defend its own land." Now, I'm not sure Hezbollah had the ability or even the desire to send troops into Syria at this point, but how about that? As Syrian forces are kind of withdrawing day after day, some of their biggest allies, Hezbollah, saying, "You guys are good. You got this. You don't need us," right? Cool. Good. Now, we have started to see some footage and reports of Iranian-backed militias from Iraq entering or trying to enter Syria, but there's a lot of mixed information at this point. So according to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, they said approximately 200 Iraqi militiamen traveling in pickup trucks crossed into Syria overnight. I'm going to show some footage from this that's been relayed on a bunch of different channels. It's hard to tell at this point which of this footage is coming from inside of Iraq, which is coming from inside of Syria, and that's really, really important. And then which of these is new footage versus old. There's definitely been a couple circulating showing like dozens of tanks lined up that don't appear to be from the last couple days. Again, very, very mixed as to how many of these groups are actually moving into Syria to try to fight on behalf of Assad at this point. Notably, the head of Iraq's Popular Mobilization Forces, which is essentially it's the Iranian militias in Iraq, or the Iranian-backed militias in Iraq. They said that no group under their umbrella had entered Syria, and that they don't operate outside of Iraq. That second part, questionable, but notable. They came out and said, "Hey, none of our guys are there," and it doesn't appear that any of them are going. And then according to Iranian state media, Kataib Hezbollah, which is the largest and most well-equipped Iranian-backed militia, Shia militia in Iraq, they said, quote, "The group has not yet decided to deploy its fighters to Syria to fight terrorists in the country." So again, we're looking at Hezbollah saying, "You guys are good, you don't need us." Some of the largest Iraqi militia groups saying, "We haven't yet made a decision," and or "Our groups aren't there." And then Russia doing naval exercises in the Mediterranean and bombing churches. So it doesn't look at this point like any of Assad's major backers are really jumping to his defense. Now, when looking at some of these Iraqi militia groups or these militia groups in Iraq as well as in Syria, both Iranian-backed, you have to remember that a lot of these are the ones that are actively firing drones, rockets, and missiles at U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria. So it wouldn't be crazy right now if you see like a large grouping of Kataib Hezbollah, let's say, hit the open road with their flags waving, that the U.S. may take that as an opportunity to eliminate a threat. Just have to throw that out there. On that note, there does seem to be some footage showing what is an American A-10 somewhere in eastern Syria. I'm a little hesitant to show this because it's mixed right now. That's clearly an A-10 in the footage. Haven't seen anything released from the United States officially on this one, but there have been reports that SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, are conducting some sort of limited offensive in the eastern portion of the country against pro-Assad forces. The U.S. Fights alongside and has long backed the SDF. However, the majority of those operations have been counter-ISIS in nature, countering Islamic State. So I don't know if, in this case, if the SDF was to go up against Assad's forces, if the U.S. would necessarily provide that same level of enabler support. But either way, we do have forces. The United States has forces in eastern Syria. It's entirely possible that part of the A-10 support was to protect our U.S. troops on the ground. Maybe they saw some threat materializing nearby. Either way, when looking at U.S. actions in eastern Syria, nothing official at this point. Definitely worth waiting for more information in that sector. Now, from the beginning of this operation last week, essentially everything points to this being HTS-led. Right now, the Turkish-backed SNA, I've seen a lot of arguments that this is a Turkish operation. And when you're looking at who's on that side of the ledger, if you will, right on the one side, you've really got Assad along with Iran, Russia, and Hezbollah. The other side, with a lot of mixed alliances, Turkey is a major player. And Turkey has and continues to back the SNA, the Syrian National Army. But they didn't start any sort of operations in Syria until 3 days after HTS kicked off their offensive. So I think it might not be entirely accurate at this point to say this is a Turkish operation or Turkey facilitated it or pushed or anything like that, just because if it was, they were late to the party, right? They didn't take advantage of that opening chaos. It seemed like they were trying to figure out what on earth was actually happening. And at the same time, if this was facilitated by Turkey in some big Turkish plan, you would think they probably would have used some of that same timing there in the opening days to conduct some degree of joint operations against PKK forces in the north. And by and large, they haven't, at least nothing out of the ordinary. Now, the second article I wanted to get into talks a little bit about how HTS is kind of shaping the situation on the ground, and they appear to be very, very different than a lot of other similar organizations, to include groups that they've been aligned with in the past. This is coming from an article written by Aaron Zellin in War on the Rocks titled, "The Patient Efforts Behind Hayat Tahrir al-Sham's Success in Aleppo." And essentially, he's talking about nation building. The group has gotten smart, and more on that here in a second. But Zellin just yesterday posted this image showing that HTS-adjacent contractor Syria Phone began installing new cell phone towers in some of their newly taken territories. That's different, right? Not something you'd see with Islamic State or Al-Qaeda. But in his article here, Zellin writes, quote, "In the hours after the operation began, the Ministry of Development and Humanitarian Affairs began preparing new tents for internally displaced persons from the subsequent regime bombing campaign and provided village, city-based phone numbers for whom to contact most easily. There were also efforts by the committee to mobilize all medical resources for the injured and expedite the work of bakeries to meet the needs of the local population. It was not shocking to then see when the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham-led offensive took Aleppo that the Emergency Response Committee was able to quickly mitigate the bread crisis by first having Idlib bakeries send 100,000 loaves to Aleppo, but then the Minister of the Economy and Resources promising that the Syrian Salvation Government would provide the necessary resources to keep the local bakeries online. The Emergency Response Committee also quickly deployed the E-Clean Foundation to not only clean the rubble from the regime airstrikes, but also clean the streets of the newly liberated areas to illustrate their competence and care." Again, another indication here that this was not an ad hoc decision to go on the offensive, but something they had planned for quite a while. The HTS has governed territory for some time now, so they've been able to build up and kind of practice the use of these institutions. But it is notable that as soon as they moved into new territory, they brought those same institutions with them and started providing essentially humanitarian services. Continuing on, Zellin says, quote, "In addition to activity on the ground, Jalani, the leader of HTS, and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham's political affairs department have made a concerted effort to legitimize their project and make sure outside actors can accept the new reality on the ground. The HTS-led administration of military operations put out a notice to the SDF and Kurdish population in Aleppo on December 1st, noting that their fight is with the regime and Iranian proxy militias, not the Syrian Democratic Forces, offering them passage to leave Aleppo towards northwest Syria with their weapons without harassment, and affirming that Kurds are an integral part of Syria, are afforded the same rights with everyone else in the country, and that they are responsible for protecting them and ensuring they have a decent life." It's complicated, right? I mean, this is not something you would expect to see from Islamic State, who Jalani at one point was closely aligned with Baghdadi when they made their first move into Syria. It's not something you'd expect from Al-Qaeda, which the predecessor to HTS, Jabal al-Nusra, was the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria. And I think we have to recognize that these groups are smart. It doesn't mean they're good, but they're smart, and they're able to recognize what is needed on the ground to effectively seize and maintain power in a certain area. They went on saying that HTS even invited international journalists and organizations to come to the liberated areas via its Center for Media Services to see the reality on the ground. Neither the Islamic State nor al-Qaeda would tolerate such messaging to minorities or foreign countries, highlighting a huge difference in discourse from just a decade ago. And Zelen, in wrapping up here, said, quote, "Yet there is still the issue that foreign fighters and foreign terrorist groups remain within the offensive's ranks, as well as the fact that Hayat Tahrir al-Sham backed Hamas's October 7th terrorist attack against Israel and eulogized Ismail Haniyeh and Yahya Sinwar." So remember earlier when I said mixed emotions around all this? It's kind of what I'm getting at. So HTS, designated terrorist organization, Jawlani, clear ties in his past to al-Qaeda and Islamic State. Not a good dude, not a good organization, not by a long shot. However, it does appear that they are doing good things for the people on the ground in Aleppo, at least, right? And when you're looking at it from their perspective, it's entirely possible that HTS and what they're bringing to the city right now is a better option for them than Assad, and certainly better than Islamic State. So in that sense, we'll call it positive. But again, as I've said countless times, it's an incredibly, incredibly complex conflict. But anyways, we'll keep an eye on Hama. It sounds like the offensive is continuing in that direction. But that's all I've got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.